So my Syrian heritage on my Jiddo side, so my mom's dad, was originally Nizari Ismaili, which means they go back in roughly the same region in Syria, in Selamiya, near Masyaf Castle, yes, from Assassin's Creed, roughly 1,000 years on my Jiddo side. But Teta's family, so my mom's mom, was an Arab Christian from Homs. And one time I asked how far back her family went in the region, and the answer I got was, oh, the whole way. Start here 8. Historical Erasure Part 3 of 3. Are modern Palestinians all descended from Arabs who invaded in the 600s CE? No. And part of the reason we know that's true are people like my teta. On her side of the family, I am descended from Christian converts from centuries before the Islamic Empire ever came to the Levant. And that's just one example of Arabs in modern-day Levant who can trace their heritage back in the same region well before the 600 CE. For example, did you know that when the Arab Muslims invaded the Levant, one of the armies they fought against was an Arab Christian dynasty called the Ghassanids, who were allied with the Byzantines at the time? Before that, you have the Lyhians, the Salihids, warrior queen Muawiyah, and the Tanuchids, the Amisans, the Parthian Mesopotamian vassal kingdoms. And one of my personal favorites, the Nabateans, who built Petra like from Indiana Jones, that's in modern-day Jordan, and they had a thriving, incredibly technologically advanced kingdom centuries before Christianity, all Arabs in the Levant before the spread of Islam. All of these groups of pre-Islamic Arabs were just part of the many migrations in and out of the Levant over the millennia that we have already discussed several times in this series. Now, one of the things I harp on a lot in my historical content is history is ugly, actually. It rarely holds up to modern scrutiny, which is why it's always so important in these discussions to make sure we have them in the proper historical context. But even through that lens, by the time the Muslim armies got to the Levant in particular, the fighting was not particularly brutal if there was any at all. By that point, most people were kind of just ready to pay a tribute, sign a paper, and cry uncle. To make a long story very short, the Byzantines and the Sasanians had just finished their own war and completely worn each other out. They weren't ready to defend against sieges by a fresh, fanatical Muslim army, and most of the subjects of the Byzantine Empire were completely sick of them and entirely ready to try out a new authority. As Bernard Lewis put it, the change from Byzantine to Arab rule was welcomed by many among the subject peoples who found the new yoke far lighter than the old, both in taxation and in other matters. One of the reasons the Muslim Empire was able to last for so long was because they implemented something kind of unprecedented, a systematically protected second-class citizenship that did not require people to convert to Islam while still affording them a general amount of safety and communal autonomy. Zionist propaganda really likes to harp on the dhimmi status as if its sole purpose was to subjugate and humiliate non-Muslims such as Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and later almost everyone else like Hindus, Jainists, and Sikhs. But the reality is that for its time, overall, the dhimmi status was a remarkably progressive policy at the time, a way to formalize and systematize protection for people in an Islamic empire who did not want to convert to Islam. And of course, over 5 centuries in this massive empire, there are plenty of examples of outbreaks of violent subjugation and humiliation, but in general, particularly when compared to its predecessors on this scale, the Islamic Empire was a remarkably progressive and pluralist society, and that allowed for a process of Arabization and Islamization to occur throughout the centuries, and I'm going to read directly from Decolonized Palestine about this. We must view Islamization of newly conquered lands and their Arabization as 2 distinct phenomena. The Islamization process began instantly, albeit slowly. Persia, for example, took over 2 centuries to become a majority Muslim province. The Levant, much longer. The Arabization of conquered provinces, though, began later than their Islamization. The beginning of this process can be traced back to the Marwanid dynasty of the Umayyad Caliphate, who were not always the nicest people. Until that point, each province was ruled mostly with its own language, laws, and currency. The process of the Arabization of the state united all these under Arabic-speaking officials and made it law that the language of state and commerce would become Arabic. Thus, it became advantageous to assimilate into this identity, as many government positions and trade deals were offered only to Muslim Arabs. Last bit, so although the vast majority of the population of these lands were not ethnically Arab, they came to identify as such over a millennium. Arabs stopped being a purely ethnic identity and morphed into a mainly cultural and linguistic one, in contrast to European colonialism of the New World, where the native population was mostly eradicated to make place for the invaders. The process in MENA is one of the conquered peoples mixing with and coming to identify as their conquerors without being physically removed, if not as Arabs, then as Muslims. All of which brings us to the final point, which is that Arab does not mean Muslim. The majority of Muslims in the world aren't even Arab. It's less than half. Muslim is not Arab. And both of those two things are separate from Palestinian, just due to where they lived. The Palestinians were Arabized, Islamized, Christianized, everythingized, and none of that ever made them any less Palestinian. And absolutely none of this has anything to do with the violent settler colonial occupation and oppression today. As I've shown in this series in multiple ways, the majority of Palestinians are descended from the ancient peoples of that land as far back as you want to look. Even if the Palestinians had only been on the land for a mere 1,300 years, that would have no relevance to a violent settler colonial occupation today. And for anybody to even remotely suggest that to be the case should insult your intelligence. And it's just such a shame, because there is absolutely a continued Jewish presence in the Levant. And like all histories, that includes eras of prosperity, persecution, beauty, and brutality. My teta is almost certainly descended from Jews in the Levant who converted, but instead of celebrating and studying that interconnected history, we're arguing about it because some people don't like that doesn't support their political narrative. No culture is a monolith, no ethnicity is homogeneous, and none of this ancient history justifies violent land theft, which is what Zionism is at its core. It's just not how history works, or how ancestry works. It's not how any of this works. And that goes double in a region like the Levant. And on that note, next up we'll discuss indigeneity and the rise of nationalism during the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Thanks for watching.